You are listening to ESL Talk, a podcast made for English teachers by English teachers. Here are your hosts, Daniel and Golnaz.
Hello again. Welcome to episode 6 of ESL Talk.
Hello. Today we want to ask you a few questions to begin. So, have you ever taken time to think about how you do things in class? Or do you ever reflect or think about your approach? Does this change depending on your students?
This week's episode is all about how to develop your classroom practice, both in an online space and a classroom space. We will be speaking to our special guest, Manuela, who has over 15 years of ESL teaching experience. Manuela actually reached out through hearing our podcast, so we would encourage you also to get in touch if you want to help the English teaching community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been amazing how much response we've had from the podcast. So thank you everyone for your support. With Manuela today, we'll actually discuss in detail the issue of equitable classroom practices in teaching international students. And we can hopefully learn to successfully develop our own strategies for effective English teaching.
So, Daniel, let me ask you, how did you first think about your classroom practice?
Well, to be honest, it started when I first began my teacher training. So when I was in the UK, I did what's called a PGC, or a postgraduate certificate of education in secondary English education. So while I was doing this, there were parts of the course, parts of the training program, which talked about classroom practice, but it was never a list of you should do A, B, C, D, and E. It was more of this is something that you need to figure out. Everyone has their own style. Everyone has their own way of managing their classroom, doing things, procedures, and how they teach essentially. So it's something that developed over time and something that needed lots of tweaking. And a lot of that came from feedback. So back when I was training, I would observe a lot of my peers' lessons. I would observe other subjects, and I would also be observed myself. So from all of those observations, I got a lot of feedback, which helped me to decide how to, practice my classes. And then also feedback from students as well was really important. So I took all that feedback on board. That helped kind of dictate my classroom practice, how I'm going to do things, what works well, what doesn't work well. And then obviously I had to tweak it as well, depending on the classes I was teaching. So I was thinking about it initially when I was first training, but I've always been thinking about it even up till today. So Golnaz, for you, how did your training help prepare you for, interpreting and developing a classroom practice?
Well, at first, when I started my training, we were prepared for this. We were taught about this, our classroom practice and the approach that we need to have in the classroom, the whole class management idea. But what I can say about myself is that during the course and during the training courses, I did not learn everything that I have learned today. So I learned a lot of things in my experience, in the experiment with classrooms and with experiencing with teaching. A lot of things cannot be, to be just realistic, a lot of things cannot be taught to you during the training courses. A lot of sensitive details cannot be covered during those courses. And it's only when you are in the situation, when you experience with it, that you can really learn, okay, in these cases, I need to do this. And especially with different students, you can see and you can feel that you need to change and switch from technique to technique, from approach to approach. So like one way and one style does not work in the same classroom. It might work in one classroom, but it's not going to work in the other classroom. So, my training did prepare me for the whole, the general gist of what's going to happen, but not all the details, of course. So, I want to ask you about the role of feedback, Daniel. What role did feedback play in helping you decide your approach in the classroom? Because for me, it was just the feedback that I received from my supervisors or from my peers during, the whole years that I was teaching. It helped me develop and change to what I am today. How was it for you?
Very much the same as what you've just said. So definitely, as students, we should never underestimate the power of feedback. And as teachers, it's exactly the same. Never underestimate the power of feedback. That kind of directs and, signals everything that you should be doing. If something is working well and you get feedback to say that it's working well, then you can improve it. You can continue that process. If you get feedback that something's not working well, then you can refine your approach. You can improve it again and try something a different way. If we don't know something is working or isn't working, then how can we improve it? So as a teacher, I always ask for feedback from my students, if they're young students, from their parents, from my peers, and also from, other people who aren't teachers, because we need to know how can we teach well to that audience. If I'm teaching 6-year-old students or 16-year-old students or 26-year-old students, my approach needs to be very different. And how do I know what my approach is going to be? Well, I have an idea, but then from feedback and speaking to the students and asking them, what did you enjoy? What works for you? Why did you like this activity? Why didn't you like this activity? That's going to help and really direct my teaching and my practice and make sure that my approach is correct and it's going to benefit the student. It's all about, meeting the goals of students. And if we can do that through having the right approach and taking their feedback on board, students are going to think, wow, the teacher actually cares about my learning and they care about what I think and they want to improve the lessons for me. So I think it's a really powerful tool that we shouldn't underestimate, and a tool that we should always refer back to keep improving our practice, because every class is different and every student is different.
And well, exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to also ask you this. Is your approach the same now as it was 10 years ago, considering
No.
everything that has, the whole development that you've had?
Absolutely not. Initially, I thought, okay, if I plan and I do a really good lesson plan that's structured, I have all the activities and the timing, it's going to be perfect. I soon learned that that wasn't the case, because you can plan really well and it can help. Obviously, a good plan really helps, but you need to know your learners. What's my learner's ability? What are my learners' skills? What are they good at? What aren't they good at? How many students do I have? If I have a class of 20 students and a class of 30 students, that's going to really change my practice and my approach. So it's more about getting on board with your learners, knowing what they're able to do, what they're not able to do, pushing certain learners, stretching other learners, supporting other learners. So you have so many different roles to play, and it's kind of like a juggling act when you're in the classroom. It doesn't matter if you have 1 student, 2 students, 30 students. You have to know, how can I be effective for all my students, and how can I change things and tailor things and, tweak things for that audience? It's kind of like, I don't want to say you're like telling a story, but you kind of are. Your lesson is a story, and it's, how do I get you interested in my story? How do I get you to engage with my story? How do I get you to respond to my story in your own way? So absolutely, my approach to feedback changed. And now more than ever, I realize how important it is. Without feedback, you're kind of going in blind, and you can't really plan or deliver the best lessons without good feedback. So enough about feedback for me, but going back to the students a little bit, Golnaz, for you, how did the students in your classroom influence your approach towards them?
Well, I could say the 90% of my approach is built on my students, has been built on my students all the time. And it has changed. It has had to change all the time. Mm-hmm. Something that I was thinking about was, when you're doing your CELTA, the first thing before you enter the classroom and before you start planning your lessons, the first thing that they ask you to do is creating the class profile. So why do they do this? Because mainly everything depends on the students and who you are going to teach. So how you want to plan and what kind of approach you want to have in the classroom, let's say theoretically and psychologically, depends on the students. So it is, it's not something that we can it is a fact that we cannot deny. So for me also, it has been naturally the same way. My students have, influenced my approach very much. Like the approach that I had in Turkey was totally different from the approach that I had in Iran, for example, in many different ways. It was because of the students, but it was also because of the new things that I was learning. So yeah, I could say that the main core of a teacher's approach should be the students and who we are like dealing with and who we are working with. They are the main focus of everything for us in the classroom.
Yes, 100%, definitely. And I can definitely agree because, I've taught in South Korea where I didn't speak the language. Initially, I didn't know the culture that well. I was in a new environment and my approach and my classroom management skills changed and developed so quickly compared to when I was in the UK and I was working with more domestic students where we were comfortable speaking in English and we could communicate ideas very easily. So my approach was different for that. And now working with adults in Canada, some domestic and some international, I kind of had a blended approach. So I've got to take both of those things and put them together to be, more efficient and more effective for everybody. So I guess that kind of ties into my, I wouldn't say my teaching style, kind of my teaching style, but it's kind of linking into one more question that I have for you. So do you think it's better in the classroom to be strict or to be relaxed or both? Because I guess teaching adults, it can be a little bit difficult to know how to manage this. So what do you think?
Well, never too strict because, I mean, not just when you're teaching, I mean, this is my approach in life. Never too strict because it just wears you out and wears others out. But like you need to have, you need to be determined in what you are doing, what you need to do, and you need to have authority in the classroom. By authority, I don't mean the traditional, style and approach to teaching that, okay, teacher is the boss and the students should obey. No. Nothing like that. But by authority, I want to say that in the classroom, the teacher is in charge of certain things that the students are not. This should be clear in the classroom and in your approach. And the students should feel this, that, okay, the teacher is in charge of these things, and I am in charge and accountable for these kinds of things. So, I could say a kind of a mixture between relaxed, friendly, of course, and also a little bit authority because it's just necessary. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think for sure you have to maintain and strike that balance depending on your audience and who your students are. I think for younger students, not necessarily strict, but just to be more firm and just kind of realize that we're here to learn. We can have fun, we can enjoy it, but we need to make sure that we achieve the goals of the lesson. For maybe, teenagers or students who are a little bit older, you can be a little bit more relaxed. You can try to talk to them and to, get to know a little bit more about them because that way they can really feel like, you're on their side and you're invested in them. And that will definitely reap rewards for you when you're teaching them. And then as for adults, it's all about, reminding adults that they need to be responsible for their own learning, and you'll support them and guide them. You'll give them the tools and what they need to be successful. But ultimately, it's up to them to put it all into practice. So it does depend a little bit on that. But this kind of leads me into one more question, which is about, the approach in the classroom or online. So first, Golnaz, I'll ask you, what's your approach, being on the classroom and being online? What do you think would be the differences?
Well, with the pandemic and with the whole, abrupt switch that we had to online classrooms, we could see that a lot of different things that we could do and we could have in the classroom face to face could not happen online. So this is a fact. And because of this, because of the whole different system and because of the whole different presentation that you have during the class, during teaching, it necessitates you to have a different approach when you are teaching online as well. So for me, it was that the first thing that I was really, I had to kind of, be flexible about and try to change was the fact that I could not have my students be engaged enough as they were when we had a face-to-face classroom. Well, the first reason was because, the whole change was very, abrupt, and nobody was expecting it. So, the students were kind of forced to, there was no other option for us. We could not continue face-to-face. But rather than that, the whole monitoring thing, you cannot monitor everything like you can do in the classroom. And you cannot, for me, not being able to monitor well meant not being able to give feedback well. And, and eventually not being able to keep my students focused on where it should be focused. So this was a really challenging thing for me. And I really had to, develop new skills and try to adapt to this, because it was really difficult. And I cannot say that I perfectly mastered it, but I could learn a lot. I mean, I learned a lot that, the whole online world the whole online teaching world is a totally different world.
Right.
What about you tell us about your experience with this, Daniel.
Yeah, luckily, I've been teaching online for a few years prior to the whole COVID situation that's happening at the moment. So I kind of have a little bit of experience, but I remember my first online lesson, I was terrified because, again, in a classroom, I kind of feel comfortable. It's my safe space. Even though I have 20 or 30 students, I feel like, well, I'm in control. We know the dynamic. I've practiced. I've done this many times, so it's okay. But online, as I mentioned earlier, you can't really, develop an approach because you're going in blind, especially the first time. So I always think teaching online classes, it's always really nice to have a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes at the beginning to just kind of ask your student how they're doing, how's their day. How was the homework? How was the class? If there's anything interesting that happened, just to kind of break the ice, first of all. And then always online, it's great if you can have a student with their camera on, not to kind of monitor them and make sure they're doing the work, but more just to respond. Again, if I can see someone on the other side, then I can respond to them. If they look puzzled, I can ask them. If they have a question, I can explain something again. If they're laughing or smiling, then that hopefully means they're enjoying the material, they're enjoying the class. So it is a little bit difficult sometimes when I have students who can't or won't turn their cameras on, and there's lots of reasons for that. So I understand it's not always possible. But in the online classroom, I think the approach is, again, be yourself. You can be a little bit more human. You can have a little bit more fun, and you can kind of use technology to your advantage. I've used a lot of different tools for online teaching, Skype, Zoom, Teams, these kind of things, and they all have their benefits and drawbacks. And I guess, I might, if I was to give some advice to other English teachers, it might just be find a tool that works for you. The majority of people seem to like Zoom, which I can understand. It's pretty user-friendly and it's good for students. So that could be a good way to do that. But within that, build an approach. So don't just share a screen with a blank document and type on it. That's not really engaging. Maybe just have a slide or a couple of slides, or design something a little bit more attractive for the students to see, so that when you're working, they're at least a little bit more engaged. There's some stuff that's prepared. So if you can do that, that will help, definitely. And then try to get your students involved when you're teaching online as much as possible. In the classroom, it's a lot easier, but online, you might not have much of a chance to do that. So every few minutes, and maybe after every 5 or 10 minutes, a quick knowledge check, a quick RCQ, just to make sure they're still engaged. Maybe go over, review something, ask them to summarize information or to give a definition of something, or maybe just to reflect on what they've done, a short writing task even, just so that they're still feeling involved and they're still able to respond as much as possible. I think that's a really nice way to approach the online learning classroom.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. That was perfect advice. I'm sure all of us will be using this in our classroom. Now we are ready for the interview portion of our episode today. Today with us, we have Manuela, our special guest. So stay tuned as we are going to interview her.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next part of today's podcast, which is the interview section. Today we have Manuela joining us. Hello, Manuela. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you both for having me.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to have one of our listeners actually get in contact and request to be on the show. So thank you so much for doing that. So just for our listeners, Manuela, a little bit about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, your early life, and what led you to teach English?
Sure. I grew up in a bilingual, bicultural home. So at some early age, I feel like I knew that I was different from my other peers, particularly my peers in school. I knew that the linguistic and cultural dynamic going on at home was different and unlike that of most of my peers. And I was always just really drawn to language and culture. I just always had a fascination with language and how it works. Um, and I always felt fascinated with cultural differences as well. This was always very appealing to me. And I always think if I didn't go into ESL teaching, I would probably have gone into something like anthropology because I'm always just fascinated with culture. So that was just, some of my early background. But in leading this to teaching, I think that, the world of ESL, I was very well aware that it would allow me to meet students from all over the world and learn about their culture, their languages. And this is a big part of what attracted me to the field. And I always say that, even though my students, I have to say, I think that ESL students are probably the most gracious and the best that you can have. They're always so appreciative. And even when they thank me for my teaching at the end of a semester or the end of a course, I always just kind of go right back and say, well, I learned just as much from you as you did for me. So
Right.
it's really an even language exchange. And I started teaching in intensive English programs when I started out as a teacher after getting my master's degree. And that kind of, going from intensive English programs, that kind of morphed into other higher ed positions, including the one that I'm in now.
Beautiful. Just the things that you shared about like the feelings that you get as a teacher, as an ESL teacher. I'm sure we all share that feeling, and it's just a one of a kind feeling, to be honest. So, Manuela, you're working professionally as an ESL specialist. Would you want to explain a little bit more about what exactly an ESL specialist does?
Sure. Well, my role is very much a support role. So, in the institution of higher ed that I work, we don't have a curriculum that is designed specifically for intensive English programs. We don't have courses for credit that are bridge programs for ESL students. And that's mainly because the TOEFL requirement it's above a 90. So obviously at that level, they've established quite a high level of English language proficiency. So we don't have particular courses for credits just for ESL students. So my role in the work that I do in the Academic Support Center as the specialist. So I work a lot one-on-one with students and just trying to help, whether it's domestic or international students, managing reading assignments. So giving them reading strategies to make the volume of reading and the complexity of reading just more digestible, and also helping them through complex writing assignments and really anything they need support on. Sometimes my role also has to do with advocacy, so to advocate for different needs that ESL students might have, and training. So in the center that I work in, we also have a tutoring center and a writing center. So part of my role is also to work with trainings for the writing tutors that work with native speaking students on their writing, but also with ESL students that come in and giving them tips and offering trainings for them how they can best support ESL writers.
That's a great asset to any language school or educational community, I guess. That's perfect. And about your what you have studied, you have completed an MA in Applied Linguistics, TESOL. This is the same as Daniel. I want to know, how did this help you refine your classroom approach?
Well, I think that it helped me build a foundation, a stronger foundation in areas like grammar, pronunciation, reading, right? All the skill areas where I think maybe if I hadn't had that solid background, maybe I could have developed some expertise in one of the skill areas that I was maybe most interested in or felt most comfortable. But I feel like it helped me be more well-rounded in terms of all the skill areas. In addition to that, I got, practicum experiences out of it that allowed me to focus on the importance of, student-centered learning rather than teacher-directed learning. Concepts like scope and sequence were introduced, and that really helped me in the classroom to determine, you're not just teaching ad hoc. You really want to start off with a strong scope and build a sequence out of that. So I think that's really how it helped prepare me to be a good teacher.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can speak to that as well, having done a very similar educational degree as well, that the confidence is probably the biggest asset that's going to help you to be successful and help your students the most. Because I think when you don't quite have those little bits of knowledge or the little, the full confidence to say, yep, I'm 100% certain this is how you tackle this problem or how you answer this question, having that confidence makes a huge difference. So obviously,
and I want to say that I'm sure there are teachers.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm sure there are teachers out there that, maybe don't have that background, and it doesn't mean they're not great teachers. They may be awesome teachers. They could be, but I think it just helped me, again, put that theory into practice. And, it helps to build that foundation, like I said.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as you mentioned, you're doing a lot of different things right now. You're wearing a lot of different hats. So how would you describe your classroom approach right now? Is it different for online than face-to-face lessons, or are there a lot of parallels and similarities there?
Yeah, I think like everyone else, I've been thrown into this world of trying to learn how to do things online. This abrupt shift to online learning back in the spring. So I really have had to adapt to that, just like everyone else. So if trying to find different technologies to help even my one-on-one sessions be, just fluid. Very different, not having that in-person energy. So I've had to adapt to that, and also having to think about how could my sessions help students in being active participants and not just passive learners while I'm working with them one-on-one. A lot of my work involves reviewing papers, academic papers, looking at, academic vocabulary used in papers and how do we build on that vocabulary. That tends to be a really common goal for students that I work with. So again, without that energy that you have in person, the online platform can be a challenge, but we've worked on things like using even just something as simple as using the OneDrive to learn vocabulary and context, extracting some of the vocabulary from their papers and putting it into a OneDrive shared doc that we can look at it together in context and have the student build on that during the next session. So that's one way that I've done this online, but my classroom approach is often, in general, just trying to have it be as interactive as possible, because I'm a very big believer in just the whole learning science behind the more active your participants in class can be, the more they're going to learn and retain over time, as opposed to just, sitting there and watching me give a grammar lesson. The more involved I can get them, the better.
Great. I want to ask you this question for our audience who specifically work with children. I want to know, is your approach any different when teaching children as compared to adults?
So I have to say, I've only taught children for a short time. Most of my career, I've been working with adults. But I think I would have to say, because you can't really talk about language with the children. You can't talk about clauses and how, pronouns and antecedents. And this is language that you use with your ESL students. And oftentimes they've studied English long enough that they know a lot of the jargons that have to do with grammar and language. But so obviously that's different when it comes to children. And, as I mentioned earlier, you try to make it as interactive as possible. That's so applicable when thinking about working with children, because you have to make sure everything's around a game. But again, keeping it with the goal so that it's not just about them having fun and playing a game. There also needs to be a goal in place. So I guess with kids, my approach has been that way for the short time that I did teach children, is keeping that interactive, keeping it fun for them with, they're, you're making this indirect, right? You're not letting them know that they're learning language, but you are introducing different interactive games to help them maintain attention, but also to help build their language skills.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's great to hear your approach and all these little things that maybe we wouldn't even think about. Just putting those into the mix can definitely make a huge difference. So thank you for sharing those insights. So the next question is kind of related to what we've just said, but more in terms of domestic, international, so native and non-native students. So how is your approach different when dealing with domestic students and international students like you do at the moment?
Yeah, so this is where I rely on thinking about BICS versus CALPS. So the BICS being the basic interpersonal communication skills, and the CALPS, the cognitive academic language proficiency skills. Aren't we so glad we have acronyms, because those are a mouthful. So when I think about that, so for some of my students who have the BICS in place, so they may need a little more instruction when it comes to discourse differences. And where I see in my big students, they tend to be students that they sometimes even sound like native speakers. And sometimes their professors may say to me, "Oh, I didn't even know that student was that their first language was not English. I had no idea." Because in class, they're real competent communicators in terms of their expressive language and class participation. But then when it came to the writing, that's where I need to spend some time with them and say, there are discourse differences. So when you're speaking in class versus with your peers, just having conversation, verbally, orally, that is very different than what should appear on your paper. So that's where I spend some time in discussing those differences in discourse with the BIC students. So for the students that, on the opposite end of that, there's, like I said, the CALP. So these may be my international students who haven't spent as much time in the host environment with the target language, right? So they may approach their pragmatics, their social interactions a little more formally than they should, and trying to get them to understand that those conventions also differ, and even some of the cultural and, again, the social bits that go along with that. Like, they'll say to me, "I don't understand why people pass by and say, 'Hi, how's it going? How are you doing?' And they just keep walking, and I haven't even answered their question." So this is sort of weird to students that are not used to being in the environment. So of course I have to explain some of those pragmatic differences that occur with our social conventions.
Awesome. And having all of these students from all walks of life and with different learning styles and everything, how do you ensure equity in the classroom? Why is this important?
So in ensuring equity, I think in my particular role right now, since, again, I'm not necessarily teaching courses, I'm more in a specialist role, my position in ensuring equity has to do really with even faculty interaction and reaching out to faculty. So one of the things I've done in the past has been to run workshops and evaluating English as a second language writing. So this is often a hot topic, as you can imagine. So, when professors approach evaluating writing, they might look at a student's paper. They might want to equate this and say, well, I should look at my students. I should use the same rubric for all my students. So this is where equity comes in. And, I've run workshops to talk about making sure that you look at these papers very differently. Your rubric should be different. You should be focusing on, top down, look at content, look at structure. Let's, think twice when you're evaluating things like vocabulary mechanics, grammar, of course. So these are some of the conversations that I've had. This is where my role plays in terms of equity and helping faculty think about equitable practice in their classroom and working with non-native speakers, and also being careful of assumptions. These are also conversations I've had with faculty. And, when you're teaching a topic that's really heavy on, having a historical context or a political context, this does not translate, across every culture. So if you're teaching, a very homogenous group and it's all Americans, well, if you're talking about something like the Declaration of Independence, that may be a topic that's familiar to all your students. But in thinking about students that are in your classroom where this is not a familiar, historical topic for them, just building some schema into that, making sure that they have added resources that they can refer to before even tackling assignments in which they're not as familiar with, again, the historical or the political contexts.
Yeah, definitely. Some great advice for teachers old and new. And definitely it's great that you've identified that we can't treat students the same way, that we can't have a one size fits all approach, which so many institutions follow for simplicity, but it's not the way. So it's really refreshing to hear that as well. We've kind of covered a little bit about teaching students about equity and cultural differences. So let's move it on and let's discuss specifically about equitable practices in the classroom. What do they look like? How would a student know that they're learning about equitable practices, or how would a teacher know to incorporate it into their classroom?
One thing I always say is, think about, just to start, even like know if you're a faculty member, know who your students are. Like it doesn't take much to just survey your students at the beginning of a semester and find out, are there any non-native English speakers in your class? Are there any international students in your classroom? And that may drive topic selection. You can adapt your topic selection to who your audience is. And don't we always say that when we're talking even about writing? We say, know your audience, know your purpose. Well, I think the
Absolutely.
same applies for faculty. Make sure you know who is in your, so it starts there. Who are your students? And then how will you go about selecting your topics? Providing examples of successful assignments. So if you're looking at a rubric and you're thinking about an A, offer students in terms of equitable practice, offer your ESL students some kind of sample in terms of this is what an A paper looks like, this is a B, C, etc. And also having conversations around academic integrity, which is also a hot topic that does not transfer cross-culturally. Sometimes there are assumptions that, an international student may have plagiarized. And I get those questions a lot. Did the student plagiarize? Is this a form of plagiarism? When in fact, academic integrity is not treated the same cross-culturally, and students need a little more instruction around that.
So I want to ask you another question about keeping up to date, as this is a key element to professional development and also to ensuring the quality of learners' learning. How do you keep up to date with new theories of classroom practice? And do you ever change your practice?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I do is I belong to a TESOL affiliate group in my region. And so anything that comes out of there, obviously, is subscribing to that, attending conferences that they put on in my local area. That's really helpful. I also keep informed in terms of what's going on in learning science. There's different YouTube channels that just to kind of change it up so that I'm not always reading articles, just even going to a video that has to do with learning science. And, one of the topics that I've been looking at is spacing and retrieval of information so that students can retain information better. So that's not necessarily specific to ESL practice. That's learning in general, but it's certainly applicable to ESL practice and language learning. So these are some of the things I do. I also, I'm fortunate to work with a group of colleagues who are always very kind to send resources my way. And so that's one way I stay current. And sure, if there are practices that are embedded in some of that, I will change my practice. And just think about, even when we're talking about vocabulary, for example, earlier, like how can I maybe, doing a Padlet, this is something I've done differently recently because of the shift to online learning, doing word banks and Padlet versus just, keeping a log of vocabulary, let's say, if we're using that as an example. So sure, that does help me to change some of my practices as well.
That's great. Yeah, I think as teachers, we should always be lifelong learners, and we should practice what we preach, right? We always tell our students to stay up to date, be relevant, read in their subject area, and do lots of, improvement in their own personal development. So yeah, absolutely. We should definitely do the same, Manuela. So obviously at ESL Talk, we're here to try to help existing teachers, new ESL teachers. So what advice and suggestions could you give to new or existing teachers on how to develop and promote an enjoyable and an equitable classroom environment? What does a perfect, harmonious classroom look like to you?
One that is where the instructor can be flexible. I think we get that rigidity starting early on, where we think, okay, I have all these goals I want to accomplish and objectives associated with those. And, we think that successful means accomplishing all of those and checking those boxes. But really, it's letting go of that rigidity and being flexible, adapting to the students. That's why I always say student-centered, not teacher-directed. How your student work more at their pace. And also, I'm a big believer in also surveying your students. This is something that we do often, and even in my role in different capacities, ask the students what they want. When we think about even, how does the world operate in terms of, commercial commerce, et cetera, we're always asking, what does the customer want? We have to think about it that way too. What are some of the areas that the students want to focus on? Because if you can motivate them by what it is that they're interested in, you're more likely to have successful lessons because they're invested in what it is that they're most interested in, right? So that can help drive instruction and help drive, once again, your scope and sequence and being able to adapt to that.
Perfect. And what about those who are wanting to teach English, but, are not sure how to approach it? What would be one tip you would give them?
I always say, just observe. If there's always something you're interested in, observe. Ask someone, reach out to even a community program if you can, or if there's someone in an academic setting that you're interested in, reach out, observe, and see what that's really like to get a taste of it, to see if it's a good fit. And like I said earlier, it doesn't always mean going into a graduate program and getting your master's degree in applied linguistics. It might mean, first start out, start doing some online teaching, see how that goes. You can do it on a one-on-one basis. Do it there's so many opportunities. You could do it one-on-one. You could do it in group. There's so many opportunities. There's so many settings you can be in, and just figure out what's right for you. See what others are doing. Form a community. That's what I think is really important too. This is even an example here of just, finding out about something new and what are people doing out there. Stay current and stay connected.
100% true. Exactly. Dipping your toes in the water and, just starting with the experiment, experiencing it is just the best teacher of all, I guess. Thank you so much, Manuela, for sharing your unique insights on how to promote equitable practices for the students. I personally learned a lot. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you,
Thank
Manuela.
you both so much. I really appreciate it. Nice to meet you both. Good luck with the podcast, and I'll be continuing to tune in.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. So if you'd like to share your experiences or get involved in the podcast, feel free to get in touch at esltalkpodcast@gmail.com. Or as always, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook.
And thank you everyone for the wonderful support so far. We continue to grow and increase our listenership each week, and we thank you for listening.
We'll see you next week, guys. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for even more ESL teaching content.